נעשה באנגלית, סלח לי. In this lecture, I shall continue my own reflections on a form of jouissance that may be elicited from 16th century Kabbalistic material, and I will ruminate again on the ramifications of this idea for a transvaluation of gender. The idea that I will explore relates to the demiurgic playfulness in the incomposite will of Ein Sof, a will that is devoid of willfulness, or that wills nothing extrinsic to itself. This will is typically located in Keter, also referred to by the Zoharic expressions Atika Kadisha, Arichampin, Stima Dechostim. These designations allude to the fact that the will is the origin, the aleph, that is before the det, the beginning. A place where we cannot discriminate between being and non-being, between presence and absence, between necessity and contingency, between eternality and temporality. In rather bold language, the activation of this will, this ratzon, is portrayed in images that rhetorically convey autoerotic arousal. When the mythopoiesis is mapped psychoanalytically, the act of Ein Sof can be viewed as akin to the narcissistic desire of the male to expand the contours of self into the space of the feminine. The other that remains, as Lacan put it, the forever other, because there is no other of the other. But if there is no othering of the other, then the other must necessarily be, as Lacan wrote, the locus in which everything that can be articulated on the basis of the signifier comes to be inscribed. That is, the other in its most radical sense. Lacan concedes that there is no other without the inscription of the phallus, the seminal signifier, even if we accept that the other as lack, typically aligned with the feminine, resist the totalization of the symbolic signification. Expressed in a rigorous nomenclature, the auto-affection of the man is to search for the first home. That is, the nostalgia for the mother womb who has given birth to and enveloped him, sheltering and sustaining him. In the topography of the phallic imaginaire, love of self takes the form of a return to and through the other, but the other is, at bottom, an extended part of the self. The primary expression used by the Sefatian Kabbalists to communicate this motif, as it applies to Ein Sof, based on biblical and rabbinic precedent, is Sha'ashua. In later sources, however, other terms are used as well, especially the word ta'anug, which denotes an experience of spiritual delight or noetic ecstasy, to be distinguished from physical pleasure and sensual gratification. In his wide-ranging analysis of the term ta'anug in Kabbalistic and Hasidic sources, Idel argues that the emphasis on pleasure for the human mitigates against those who would ascribe to Kabbalistic piety, and especially in Hasidism, a categorical denunciation of the physical and the adoption of a spirituality predicated on an austere asceticism. In my previous work, and again today, I offer a different perspective on the relationship between the ascetic and the erotic poles of the mystical experience. One may elicit from the Kabbalah a more complex interface of the two, such that abstaining from sex is not necessarily denigrating the sensual, nor is engaging in sex necessarily exalting the sensual. My view accords more with the judicious comment of Verblovsky, and I quote, "Kabbalism seems to have been the first ascetic system to develop a mystical metaphysic of the sexual act. The Kabbalists were ascetic in the extreme and could and he's talking about 16th century Kabbalists, were ascetic in the extreme and could justify the sexual act and praise its mystical significance only if and because it was performed without carnal pleasure." Now, one may quibble with the claim that Kabbalah is the first doctrinal system to enunciate the convergence of asceticism and eroticism. I think that's an oversimplification on Verblovsky's part. But there can be no question that it is an appropriate description, and especially for the 16th century material. My aim here is to consider the philosophical underpinning of the mythopoetic symbolism conveyed by the word sha'ashua, which denotes a mode of musing and bemusing, playing or toying with oneself that is both orgasmic and contemplative. starting from the assumption that there's nothing but the light of infinity. Here, you don't have this on the handout, but let me read you the words of Ramak from Sefer Elima. Talking about the Ein Sof. She'achar shehu hakol, hakol hu ba'achduto, bilti mita'el me'atzmo, el atzmo, shehu uf'ulotav v'chachmato u'ritzono u'vinato v'chasadav hakol echad. She'enam pu'ulot yotzot, ela hu ba'atzmo me'atzmo, ela atzmo echad. Or perhaps in the shorter, but making the same point, Chaim Vital writes about Ein Sof that it is the Or Elyon Pashut Memalei Kol HaMetziut. So if we assume that to be the case, then the primary creative act must be one of self-begetting, what these Kabbalists most typically refer to as Sha'ashua. So just to read from Bracha Zak's comment about Sha'ashua in the 16th century material. Sha'ashua Ein Sof, she writes, Me'atzmo el atzmo mesamen pulat מחשבת אלוהית שיש בה מעין התחלה של תנועה לקראת התפשטות. Now, with regard to the question of gender of the infinite, which I think you would all agree is a reasonable question to ask, since the Ein Sof is described here as mishtasheh ba'atzmo, or according to some versions, ba'atzmuto. So we have three viable views. One, since Ein Sof is utterly non-differentiated, it is beyond all attribution, including that of gender dimorphism. Second, that Ein Sof is neither male nor female, but it is nonetheless depicted primarily as the former, as male, within which the latter, the female, is contained. And although the infinite is often treated apophatically in this material as the unfathomable that has no name or appellation, it's still described as light consistently, and the character of light is to proliferate, and that is further linked to the midah of chesed, and that attribute is consistently gendered as masculine. And the third option is Ein Sof is neither male nor female, but it is described as feminine, or more specifically by the symbol of mother. Now, this does appear with much less frequency, but there is some evidence to that final option as well. But despite the seeming promise of this possibility, Kabbalistic symbolism is, in my view anyhow, impeded by an overbearing phallomorphism that applies to maternal imagery as well. There is no evidence to substantiate the contention that the motif of the phallic mother can be construed as a gynocentric criticism of masculinity. That was offered by Abrams. Nor does it lead credence, and now I'm referring to a thesis by Elaine Haskell in her book on mother and breastfeeding. There's no credence to the presumption that the male Kabbalists desired to cultivate experiences of the divine that were not circumscribed within a phallocentric discourse, that is, a discourse for and about men that has little concern for women's self-representation, extricated from the mire of a patriarchal framework of meaning and gender inscription. As feminist theorists have shown, a feature of the phallomorphic mindset is a totalizing nature. All is subsumed under the sign of the phallus. This is not to say that Kabbalists were unaware of the fact that the female body is independent of the male, or that they were oblivious to the social roles unique to women. Acknowledging these truisms does not defy the truth that the phallus is viewed in Kabbalistic symbolism as a decisive marker by which both masculinity and femininity are to be assessed. Elizabeth Gross reminds us of this rudimentary axiom of feminist theory, and I quote, "Phallocentrism is explicitly not the refusal of an identity for women. On the contrary, there seems to be a proliferation of identities: wife, mother, teacher, nun, secretary, whore, etc., but rather the containment of that identity by other definitions and other identities. It is not surprising, therefore, that qualities unique to the physiology of women are appropriated by Kabbalists, however problematic and repugnant this may be from a feminist perspective. These experiences of women, including breastfeeding and other maternal traits, are not to be taken on their own terms in Kabbalistic texts, but only as they are specularized through the prism of a patriarchal symbolic order. The following appraisal virigere by Butler can, in my opinion, be applied to Kabbalists. The reinscription of the maternal takes place by writing with and through the language of phallic philosophians. The textual practice is not grounded in a rival ontology, but inhabits, indeed, penetrates, occupies, and redeploys the paternal language itself. To mime means to participate in precisely that which is mimed, and if language mimed is the language of phallogocentrism, and this is only a specifically feminine language to the extent that the feminine is radically implicated in the very terms of a phallogocentrism it seeks to rework. Okay, so that's the theoretical framing, and now we go about looking at some of the texts together. So I myself, and maybe it's my limitations, but after all these years laboring in the Pardes, I just don't see that there's evidence to validate the hypothesis that the Kabbalistic gender play disrupts what's been referred to as a monist phenomenological unity by positing a genuine and irreducible sense of otherness. Even in contexts where there is an ostensible reversal of the accepted hierarchy, a more careful scrutiny of these texts divulges that the feminization of the male comes at the expense of masculinizing the female. Simply put, the dynamic of gender operative in these sources does not accommodate the possibility of the male being feminized without the female being masculinized. As I'm sure some of you know, I've argued that one of the strongest proofs of this is the localization of the feminine in the Ateret Brit. But I don't want to belabor that symbolism here. But let me turn to one of the first texts in the handout, and this is from Sarug's Limudei Atzilut, and he's describing the Olam HaNekudot, which in Lurianic Kabbalah, as you know, is also referred to as Olam HaNekudim, which is assigned to the Olam HaTohu, the constellation of the Or Ein Sof in these Nekudot, in which the Shvirat HaKelim occurs, and that results, as you know, in the restructuring of the light in the Olam HaTikun. So turning to the first passage. Amalchut shel hayesod אינה נראית כי היא דבוקה ביסוד. כשהיא דבוקה ביסוד, כלומר בגילוי נקרא בלשון זכר, כמו שכתוב, זה הדבר אשר מל יהושע כל העם היוצא ממצרים. ומילה הוא גילוי העטרה, וכשהעטרה מכוסה ואינו מגולה, you see, even the dikduk is problematic, right? You would think it should be eina, but it's sort of driven, either you could say it's just that, but I don't think so. I think the mistake is here driven by the symbolism. Ve'eino megula, ve'eino nirea. Azai nikra v'lashon nekeva zot. Tichtiv v'achar ori nikfu zot kinibsari echaze Eloha. הרי לך בהדג'ה שהעטרה שהוא גיבוי נקרא זכר זה, וכשהוא מכוסה בערלה נקרא בלשון נקבה זאת. So the text certainly attests that the play of gender is fluid, right? And the sense of the androgyne entails the transgendering possibility of the male becoming female and the female becoming male. But it is not accurate to say, as someone has argued, that this fluidity, quote, is arguably more performative than essential, which is a basic theory of Judith Butler. Political correctness aside, the performative nature of gender mutability affirmed by Kabbalists is a byproduct of a taxonomy which, in my opinion, is quite inflexible. Thus, in the text we just read, Sarug argues that the feminine malchut is signified by the masculine demonstrative pronoun zeh when she is conjoined to Yesod and disclosed as the atara through milah. But she is signified by the feminine zot when she is concealed in the orla. Bracketing the intrinsic connection that is forged here between femininity and the demonic, what's most relevant to our discussion is the fact that both the concealed and revealed aspects of malchut are contingent on the female being located in the Ever HaZachar. Now, it may be the wish of some that, and here again I'm quoting, the drama of redemption can be reconfigured not in terms of totality but of infinity, precisely because the phallic pretension to completeness has been circumcised. This is what somebody's argued against me. But this queering of what I think is a kind of queering of the phallomorphism, as it were, a kind of circumcision of circumcision, is not corroborated by Kabbalistic texts. Right, so this attempt here to distinguish between totality and infinity. So this effort to speak of the Ein Sof as if it were the unspeakable infinite is much more complicated than the Levinasian distinction between totality and infinity, which this individual has tried to uphold. In fact, we can't apply the Levinasian distinction because for the Kabbalists, infinity is precisely totality. And we'll talk more about that. So Ein Sof can be envisioned, certainly, as the infinite nothingness that cannot be constricted by images of affirmation or negation. So it's beyond both. And it is, I think, fair to say in a postmodern way that Ein Sof is the indeterminate essence that has no essence. Right? And we even might want to say that it is the otherwise than being, which is neither being nor non-being. And so we could refer to Ein Sof as the infinitely other, that can't be bound by concept and can't be thought on the basis of a horizon of the same. However, inasmuch as Ein Sof comprehends the other as part of its otherness, and remember the passage from Ramak that I read, etc. And so far as that is the case, so the spherotic emanations unfold from the very being in which they are enfolded. That means philosophically that difference is incorporated in the sameness of the one. That is, to be sure, differently the same in the unfolding of all the sphirot. So let me exemplify this from a passage taken from a short treatise, one of the few that Luria himself composed, on the doctrine of Tzimtzum. It'll be the second passage on the handout, as it relates exegetically to the beginning of the Zohar, Beresh Harmanuta de Malka, Galif Gilufei Betahiro Ila'a Botzina de Kardinuta. So in the egression of the influx from the infinite, there emerges the dyad of the light in the vessel, the Or Ukli. And the Or is correlated with Chesed, which is gendered as masculine, and the Kli with Din, which is gendered as feminine. But the latter, that is to say, the kli, which is the sense of otherness, is itself constituted by the reshimu of the or that is left behind in the makom hapanui, or the chalal, from which the light withdrew. Now let's turn to the passage. Galif gilifu, so it's the language of the Zohar, right? So the Arish explains, Lahavin mehechan nithavu hakelim betchilat ha'atzilut, achar she'en sof pashut betachlit ha'peshitut. Uferusho hu ki kodem ha'atzilut havahu ushmo echad levad, obviously a reworking of Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer. V'haya memalei makom ha'olamot kulam. So, I mean, again, the philosophical implication is this: there is no otherness. There's no otherness here, and that's what I said before. The Levinasian distinction between totality and infinity doesn't work. Ukshe'ala b'rtzono ha'pashut lahamsi ha'olamot kulam ulehitiv lezulato tzimtzem shchinato v'nistalek oro lemala ונשאר המקום שבו יבראו העולמות פנוי. וכשחזר האור ונסתלק למעלה, מחזר את האור ההוא, שהוא כוח הדין, שהיה שם, שעל ידו נסתלק האור למעלה, כי כל חזרת האור אינו כי אם מצד הדין, כי האור מתפשט לאין תכלית. ומאותו כוח הדין שהיה שם, נעשה כלי ונשאר רשימו מן האור שנסתלק במקום הפנוי, שבו היה האור מתפשט תחילה. ובזה הרשימו שנשאר נעשה הכלי הראשון. So, if you look immediately at the next text, I think Luria's point is amplified by Vital. This is from the Eitz Chaim. והנה על ידי הצמצום הזה, היה בו בחינת עצמות וחלם, כי צמצם האור גורם מציאות הוויה, כי צמצום האור גורם מציאות הוויות הכלם. ואין לנו רשות לדבר יותר במקום גבוה כזה, והמשכיל יבין ראשית דבר מאחריתו. ואומנם אינו כלי ממש, אלא שבערך האור שבתוכו נקרא כלי. אמנם הוא זך ובהיר בתכלית הזיכוך והדקות והבהירות. That the vessel is light seriously neutralizes the argument that Kabbalists posited the existence of an other that is not somehow absorbed in the infinite totality. Since the vessel is the primary symbol that they use to demarcate alterity or otherness vis-a-vis the light. Lezulato in the Aries language. Moreover, some of the most prominent 16th century Kabbalists, as we've already intimated, depicted Ein Sof in decidedly masculine imagery without a feminine complement. So even if one were to dismiss or to marginalize the textual evidence, it seems to be a dream to imagine that the male Kabbalists postulated a genuine and irreducible sense of otherness when they locate the root of the feminine in the Ateret Brit. Now this points to a collapse of gender difference into gender singularity. And again, I refer to Butler's observation, which doesn't reflect her view, but here she's again commenting on Erigere. And I think what she says about Erigere can be applied to the Kabbalists. Disavowed, the remnant of the feminine survives as the inscriptional space of that fellow Goldcentrism. And just think about the Lurianic idea, right? The Kli really emerges from the Makom Panui, or the Halal. The specular surface which receives the marks of a masculine signifying act only to give back a false reflection and guarantee a fellow Goldcentric self-sufficiency without making any contribution of its own. Okay, so Now, to note that gender is ostensibly a correlative phenomenon, right, which seems on the face of it, just commonsensical, that we can't speak of male without female or female without male. That's true. But that somehow misses the point that in a phallocentric worldview, correlativity itself is expressive of a lack of alterity, since the other is expressive of the same. So we could say that one cannot readily discover difference within difference, but rather difference within difference, which makes all the difference in the world. That is to say, it's possible to speak of masculinity without femininity because the latter is comprised in the former at the highest recesses of the divine. So, in some previous publications, and now goes back many years, I argued that there is a logic of what I call the non-correlative correlativity in some rabbinic statements, which I think the Kabbalists build upon. And it's sort of contrary to the logic of correlation, which is more typical in a Western mode of thinking, an Aristotelian logic. So, to give you a few examples, so there's a maxim in Mechilta that above there is no left. So most people interpret that to say is against anthropomorphism. But that's not what it says. It says there's no left. It doesn't say there's no right. The point is that there is a right without a corresponding left. The divine is entirely right. That's the point of that statement. And the Kabbalists developed that, and in fact described Keter as the Olam Shekulo Rachamim, the Olam Shekulo Zachar is the language that Vital uses. There's a passage in the Idra which distinguishes the Keter or the Atika Kadisha as the one eye, as opposed to at the lower level of the Erampim where there are two eyes, the right and left. So the Ayim Pticha, the open eye of Keter, again, doesn't have a second eye. It's a singular eye. And it's, putting these passages together, they're parallels in Shikatilia, that single eye is an eye that it's always being open, signifies that it's complete rachamim, without any admixture of din. Okay. There is, let me see if this is, yeah, so there is, as difficult as this is to visualize, that there can be a male prior to the bifurcation of male and female. That's exactly what is implied in the passage from the Zohar from Idra Zuta. When it says, speaking about Atika Kadisha, it says, Ba'atar de itkalilu dechar v'nukva lo itkayamu ela b'kiyuma achara de dechar v'nukva. So, Atika Kadisha is the place where the male and female are comprised one within the other. And that results in a different kind of configuration of male and female. I think that's what is implied by the language, B'kiyuma achra d'dichar v'nukva. In any event, according to a second rabbinic motif, the eschatological state is described variously as Olam Shekulo Tov, Olam Shekulo Aroch, or Yom Shekulo Shabbat. Now, by the tenets of a binary logic that's dominated Western thinking, none of these descriptions is sensible. Because in the absence of evil, how could you speak of good? In the absence of abridgment. How could you speak of something which is kulo aroch, elongated? And in the absence of the weekdays, how could you speak of either the beginning or the ending of Shabbat? But the implementation of a logic that dispenses with the correlative paradigm is precisely what some sages thought was necessary to imagine the Olam Haba, the future, an antithesis of our experience of the spatial temporal world. A world that is good without evil, a world that is diurnal without the intervention of the nocturnal, a world that is Sabbath without the interruption of quotidian time. And Kabbalists, I believe, have applied this counter logic, if you will, of this Olam Hafuch, right, to which is a logic that claims a middle excluded by the logic of the excluded middle, to explain the proto-gender of the indifference or the hashva'ah of Ein Sof, neither male nor female, not because the later is reintegrated into the former, but because within the collapse of difference, there is no longer any meaningful distinction between these opposites. Okay, so now let me turn a little bit to the Shashua motif. And to translate the Lurianic myth of Tzimtzum philosophically, we could say that the potential for boundary must be positioned within the boundless itself. For if that were not the case, then the boundless of the infinite would somehow be confined and therefore negated. This is expressed as early as the 13th century by Azriel of Gerona. That's the next short passage from his Beur Eser Sfirot. He says, Ein Sof hu shleimut b'li chisaron. V'im tomar sheyesh lo koach b'li gvul, v'ein lo koach b'gvul, ata mechaser shleimuto. So I think this is a clear articulation of the point. And the paradox of Tzimtzum, however we explain it, kipshuto, as a mashal, which, by the way, there's been a lot written about this, but I have yet to see anybody raise to a philosophical sophistication what it means to say kipshuto. I mean, what are we talking about here? We're clearly not talking. Even those who say it's kipshuto, not k'mashal, clearly can't mean pshat in a pshat way. Right? So in some sense, from a philosophical point of view, this whole debate needs to be, in my feeling about this, needs to be rethought more carefully. But, okay. So however we explain this in Tzimtzum, it ultimately is seeking to account for this emergence of difference within indifference. Okay? But ultimately, it cannot really posit an other that is not somehow a manifestation of the same. So in the final analysis, darkness is a facet of the light. Absence is a facet of presence. Evil is an iteration of good. And it follows, since all we have is the Or Ein Sof, that the initial act of generation is a self-begetting, which, as we've seen, results in the splintering of the light into a duality of light and darkness, or the light and the vessel. So I think I'm going to skip, because of time, I'm going to skip the next section, which kind of frames the philosophical dimensions of this in terms of the language of Schelling in his philosophical investigations of the essence of human freedom, which is very much based on this Kabbalistic material. So I'm gonna skip that section now. But I want to.
You have 25 minutes.
Yeah, but we could discuss it if we want. It's okay. The only advantage of reading that section is because actually Schelling already in the beginning of the 19th century, I think, gave a very clear philosophical formulation of what's going on in the Lurianic material. But okay, we'll skip that for now. So another way of viewing the Lurianic doctrine is as an elaboration of the rabbinic belief that divine creativity proceeds from a mixture of mercy and judgment, signified respectively by Shem Ufarash and Elohim. But a consequence of this is, even though there's no female counterpart to the male in either Ein Sof or Keter, we still must speak of a bechina of din, which complements the chesed or rachamim. So that the capacity for limit must already be in the limitlessness. And in Zoharic language, and the one adopted by subsequent Kabbalists, that aspect of limit within the limitless, the gvul within the beli gvul, is referred to as the botzina de kardinuta, right? Or as the kav midah. And both of these terms mark in certain sections of the Zohar, but obviously sections that became very influential, the mechanism by which the infinitely expanding light is constrained or limited. Now, it's true that even though there is no autonomous aspect of the feminine that complements the male, insofar as this quality of limit is necessary for there to be creativity outside of the Ein Sof, a very important role is assigned to the feminine quality of din. And I would say that the Ari understood that the botzina de kardinuta is the koach hadin b'toch Ein Sof, which itself is another very difficult concept to wrap the mind around. How can it be gvul within the built-in gvul? But okay, so the agency, so the botzina de kardinuta or the kav midah represent the agency that provokes the infinite to emanate the structure of mashpia and makabel. And we could speak then of the potential for zivug even before there is a partition of the gender. But if we look at it from a commonsensical point of view, then really what we're talking here is about an autoerotic simulation. Now the next one second. Okay, the next text is from Vital. So, but before we get there, so there's an expression used by Cardozo, Avram Cardozo, the Sabbatean, and it was influential in Eibeshutz, and that is zivug minei uve. So Cardozo uses this expression zivug minei uve in order to describe what we're talking about here. But I don't think there's anything deviant about this formulation. A recent edition of the text of Eibeshutz, the editor said that he found this to be deviant, but I don't think so. I think it corresponds exactly to the viewpoint that the 16th century Kabbalists were articulating. So, and in that light, let's consider the next passage from Vital, where he's discussing what he calls the zivug harishon. ואמנם בפעם ראשונה ובזיווג ראשון התעורר הזכר מעצמו, בלתי התעוררות הנקבה. ועלה בו רצון ותאווה להזדווג, אפילו שלא היה עדיין בחינת מעין נוקבין. ועל כן הזיווג הזה הוא נעלם מאוד, ולא היה בבחינת זיווג יסוד דילי ביסוד דילה, כי לא היה עדיין אז נקבה נברא בעולם. ואם כן, עם מי יהיה הזיווג בעת שנברא העולם? לכן הזיווג ראשון ההוא היה ברצון העליון, מחשבה מוחה אילאה, בסוד הרצון העליון, שכולה תחורה, ואין שם הכר נקבה והבן זה. Right, so to repeat the critical words there, which are important, I think, for understanding the gender construction, kula dechura ve'en sham heker nekeva. Or as Vital put it elsewhere in Mavosh Arim, when describing Arich Ampin, ein bechinat nukba nikeret bo begilor. Okay, so to turn back again to the doctrine of Tzimtzum. Many have tried to discuss and interpret this, but one aspect that seems to me to apply to the different explanations is in fact the feminization of the demiurgic activity of Ein Sof. So the commencement of creation occurs when the infinite will or thought, which comprises all of the sfirot, crystallizes into a nekuda. And the nekuda is located in what is called Malchut Ein Sof. Now, the idiom itself, Malchut Ein Sof, is very more common and frequent in later Kabbalists, and particularly by the Sabbatians. But it is based on what apparently was the teaching of Luria himself regarding the potential for differentiation within the indifference of Ein Sof. So Luria himself taught that Malchut is the feminine capacity within the infinite. Right? The quality of judgment that imposes measure on the immeasurable light, as we saw in terms of the Boltzina de Kardinuta. So let's again consider the language of Sarug, this time from his Perush Sifra Ditznuta. And after he has affirmed that all of the Sfirot have a root in Ein Sof, ha'eser Sfirot yesh lahem shoresh l'mala, dahainu ba'atzmut Ein Sof yitbarach. He draws a contrast between the upper 9 and the 10. Uksheba el ha'madrega Sfirat ha'malchut, she'ayta genuza ba'atzmuto yitbarach, שיער יתברך בעצמותו שבמקום הזה ראוי לבנות העולמות לפי שבכל מדרגות 9 ספירות העליונות אין צורך להיות עולמות כי כל אלה התוארים אל 9 הספירות העליונות אפשר לתארם לא גם שלא יהיה פועל באותם התוארים אבל לא יצטרך לתאור לו מלכות והיינו שולטנית אם הוא אינו שולט על אחרים. לכן הוציא לפועל כל העולמות מן נקודת מלכות שבעצמותו יתברך. The mystery of Tzimtzum is presented here as a compression of the infinite overflow into one place, which is described as the constriction of the point that makes possible the materialization of the olam, the world, or the whole, that which is mundane. So I want to emphasize this, though, that the feminine space, right, because clearly there's a strong link here being made between the feminine and space, spatiality, and that's a pretty well-known motif. But it should be underscored that that space is not only penetrable, it's not only passive, but it's also generative. It conceives as well as receives. So here I do want to quote from Eibeshitz's Va'avo Hayom El Ha'ayin, because I think he makes the point rather succinctly. And he's often, in my opinion, he's offering a lucid account of Lurianic doctrine. I don't see anything aberrant about it, which is what has recently been argued. And he's talking about the name of Chava, which obviously is glossed scripturally as Ein Kol Chai. And this is what he says. Kli, he says that she, affixed to, she receives the name Ein Kol Chai, right? Because she is, and now I pick up the text, she is a Kli HaMaaseh L'Sod HaTzimtzum. Ki Zulata Hayu HaBechinot Shehem Binyan Olamot Hayu Mitpashtim Le'en Cheker Ba'al Yada Nitan Lahem Gvul. וכך השכינה בסוד שדי שאמרה לעולם די והבן. Again, to be a vessel is not merely to be impassive. It signifies some sense of vitality which is related to the delimitation of space in order to make possible the extension. And that's what I think is implied by this language of Malchut the Ein Sof. Now, insofar as there is no absolute other in relationship to infinity, the differentiated unity that consists of the four worlds, of Atzilut, Bria, Yitzira, and Atziyah, is represented as emerging from this non-differentiated unity, or the simple unity, through this act of autoeroticism, which at the same time is one of self-contemplation. So there is a resemblance here between the Kabbalistic idea and the Aristotelian description of God as thought thinking itself. A concept that we know had a profound impact on Neoplatonic speculation, which in turn influenced the religious philosophies and mystical theosophies promulgated by Jews, Christians, and Muslims through the Middle Ages. So Shashua, I would say, names a kind of noetic jouissance. Now, what's interesting in this material is I think it translates anthropologically into an ascetic praxis of desiring not to desire. And this ascetic practice, of course, it's not absolute and unqualified, right? But for all intents and purposes, these Kabbalists in the 16th century, as other scholars have noted, did put forth a rather rigorous ascetic, at least ideally ascetic lifestyle for themselves. And that anticipates the state that is appropriate to the Messianic era. Right. So the mental bonding with and the imaginary representation of the divine is intensely erotic. Anyone who studies these texts will attest to that. But at the same time, it's predicated on a repudiation of carnal desire. So, and not only is there ample textual evidence that the Kabbalists ideally should devote themselves to a what I would call a domestic asceticism, and restrict their sexual activity to a bare minimum, but there is proof as well that even when engaged in spousal intercourse, they are required to curb their physical pleasure by imagining that they are uniting with the Shekhinah. Moreover, to the extent that the Kabbalistic symbolism is informed by the identification of the body and senses with the feminine on the one hand, and the soul and the intellect with the masculine and on the other, we can apply to this material the assumption regarding the subjugation of the maternal to the paternal. Now, it seems to me that in sync with the staging of castration as part of the Freudian Oedipal complex, the logocentrism promoted in the Kabbalistic literature is grounded in and further grounds the phallocentric import of circumcision, which they understood as the unveiling of that which must be veiled. And in this sense, the somatic inscription of the covenantal mark provides the key to understanding the play of esotericism, That is, the conviction that the secret can be revealed only insofar as it is concealed. We find in Kabbalistic sources the idea, which goes back, is also articulate, is also affirmed by the Rambam, that circumcision weakens the libido. And that in some sense, then it can be compared to castration. But I acknowledge that this can't be easily assimilated. But when reading the Kabbalistic material, nor do I accept the argument that, for instance, was put forth by Bó-Gorion with respect to rabbinic literature, that circumcision is a feminization of the Jewish male. Rather than understanding this rite as a symbolic loss that diminishes the hegemonic reign of the phallus, I would argue that Kabbalists viewed circumcision as a form of sublimation that intensifies their own phallic empowerment. The cut of circumcision relates symbolically to the ascetic abrogation of sexual desire, but that is an expression of phallic jouissance, the yearning of the man to overflow, just like the Ein Sof, and to be sheltered in the enclosure of the woman. Psychoanalytically, asceticism on the part of the male Kabbalist is a feature of the construction of self that is rooted in a primal narcissistic impulse that they attribute to Ein Sof, the impetus to extend and to be contained in the space of the feminine, the potential for otherness that lies coiled in the undifferentiated sameness of infinity. So in Lacanian terms, we could say that the eradication of the erotic embraces the paradox, now I'm quoting Lacan, that not to want to desire and to desire are the same thing. Not wanting to desire is wanting not to desire. So I think there's an astonishing affinity of Lacan's thesis regarding the mystical and transgressive character of Jouissance, to be elicited from the motif of Shashua and the teaching of Uri and other 16th century Kabbalists. Again, we ask the question, is the Kabbalistic idea of pleasure beyond pleasure akin to what Lacan calls the feminine jouissance? Or is it a jouissance that is inevitably phallic? The autoerotic pleasure of Ein Sof is linked to the feminine attribute of judgment, which ignites the masculine attribute of benevolence. And to some degree, this implies a reversal of the gender hierarchy. And indeed, the description of the feminine, the Malchut Ein Sof, as the Ateret Brit, anticipates the future when the female rises as a crown to sit atop the male. As in the case of Lacan, the incomprehensible jouissance is a pleasure that can be satisfied pneumatically only through the desire not to desire. From the Kabbalistic perspective as well, the ascetic abandonment of phallic desire is a virtue that surpasses the law, since the law, strictly speaking, mandates sexual intercourse for the sake of procreation. The transgressive nature of the jouissance is marked by the fact that it corresponds to the level of the divine characterized by the complete forgiveness, wherein all vice is transformed into virtue. The path for the human to reach that level is tshuva, which is a hypernomian foundation of the nomos, the excess of the law that involves the deferral of the distinction between guilt and innocence, a suspension that unsettles but at the same time secures the system of reward and punishment. The place from which the jouissance comes forth and to which it returns is Malchut Ein Sof, which is again the capacity for the limit lodged in the limitlessness of the Ein Sof. Okay, so I'm going to conclude again with the question about to what extent this destabilizes the binary opposition of maleness and femaleness. It cannot be denied that at the heart of the Kabbalistic teaching is a metaphysical problem of alterity. How do we establish the parameters for otherness? And the ethical struggle to adjudicate between the identity of difference and the difference of identity. The primary function of the female is to serve as that receptacle that receives or contains the seminal fluid of the male. Now, this does not mean that the Kabbalists turn the woman into a mute mute or passive surface or a negative space. The receptivity and negativity are positively affirmed. Not only is it the case that divine creativity is dependent on this dialectical process of bestowing and receiving, but in the receiving there is as much, if not more, power than in the bestowing. Indeed, receptivity is a form of giving, a motif expressed rather poignantly in the Kabbalistic understanding of Jewish men being assimilated into the Mayan Nukvin that stimulate the Mayan Duchrim. More significantly, the Kabbalists accept the gender transfiguration of the male becoming female and the female becoming male, the contained being transposed by the container and the container by the contained. What I have maintained, however, is that this play of gender operates along an unambiguous line, such that the instability is determined by a constitutive stability. That is to say, that which overflows is gendered as masculine, and that which receives as feminine. The ultimate purpose of the conjunction of male and female is for the judgment of the female to be ameliorated or sweetened, in the language of the Zohar, by the mercy of the male. So, again, turning to what is an authentic doctrine of Luria, in his commentary on Sifrei Tznuta, he expresses this very succinctly. Utzrach hama'atzil ha'elyon lehitaken b'dachar v'nukva, k'dei sheyishtalshel b'kederach zeh kol ha'atzilut v'yitbasmu hadinin v'rachamim, dahainu dachar rachamim nukva din kanoda. ולפיכך כל המלאכים שמלכו באדום, אתר דכל דינין מתקיימים, טעמן נתבטלו, עד שבא המלך האחרון עם אשתו, הדר אם היתבל, דחר ונוקבה, דין ורחמים, ונתבסרו יחד. As far as I know, with all the criticism, no one has adduced, and if anybody here can show me that I'm wrong, then I'll be very happy. No one has adduced a Kabbalistic source where this pattern articulated by the Ari is undermined. And if anybody has such a source, quite seriously, I'm not joking. I'm happy to receive it. Now, it is true, and I have discussed this as well, that a vision of the Messianic involves a transposition, right, conveyed by the images Nekeva Tesovev Gaver from Yirmiyahu, or from Mishlei Eshet Chayil Ateret Bala. It's true. So there is, coming out of the Lurianic material, and becomes very strong in certain Hasidic texts, and in Sabbatian texts as well, you have a vision of the Messianic time where there is an overturning of the hierarchy, or a toppling of the hierarchy to some extent. But these tropes, in their own way, fortify the hierarchy or the phallogocentrism. Because it may be, in fact, that the female in the end time assumes the posture of the male, and so the mashpia becomes a mekabel, but that's still following the hierarchical values of the phallocentrism. So that transposition can't really be considered a post-patriarchal deposing of the phallomorphism. A more drastic transvaluation would require the obliteration of the difference to the point that even the dichotomy of Mekabel and Mashpia would be transcended, not simply that the Mashpia becomes the Mekabel. Now, I do believe the seeds for this are contained in the text of the tradition. But I don't think the Kabbalists themselves, the traditional Kabbalists, reached this point. And as far as they could go, it was discerning that the female Mekabel can become the male Mashpia. And again, to to refer to Asri of Gerona. He already said this in the 13th century. And this is the last text. Da ki ein atzilut ne'etzal, ki im laha'id ba'achdut be'en sof. Ve'im lo haya ha'mekabel mitached b'makbil, והמקביל במקבל ומתאחד בכוח אחד, לא היה ניכר ששניהם כוח אחד. אז בהתאחדם ידע מהם כוח האחדות, ולכך כל דבר ודבר מקביל ומתקבל. So Azriel recognized that the oneness of infinity necessitates that each of the spherotic emanations should be androgynous, that is, capable of both giving like a male and receiving like a female. But the more profound subversion would be one in which there is no more giver or receiver. And the index of the ultimate jouissance, the pleasure of no pleasure, would be when we no longer had the need to speak of masculinized woman or feminized man. אפשר בעברית, שאלות, בסדר גמור.